Excellent, and there we go. Welcome to the podcast Corner of Special Education. A happy new year to all listeners and followers, and welcome to this first extra episode in English in 2025. My name is Karsten Skrull-Gundersen, and I would like to give you a most warm welcome into my corner of special education. In this year's first episode in English, on the International Day of Education, you will hear my conversation with Michael Barbour, PhD from Touro University. I contacted Mr. Barbour last year, and we sat down last summer for a conversation about different types of learning styles, educational systems, etc. The reason why I contacted Mr. Barbour was because of an article in a Norwegian magazine about these topics and of absence from school, and it was truly an interesting conversation to be a part of. With that, here's my conversation with Mr. Barbour. And with that, I would like to welcome to another episode in the podcast Corner of Special Education. And it's another episode in the series Let's Talk About. And this is, I would say, maybe the fourth or fifth episode in English. So this is primarily a Norwegian podcast, and I'm based in Oslo, Norway. So we are actually crossing the big ocean here. And we have a lot of time zones and all that. But with that, today's topic, it's blended learning. And as always, I have a guest with me. And here it's 25th of June. It's 1900 or 7 p.m. is the correct timestamp. And my guest, I would like to welcome you to my podcast. And could you give us a short introduction of yourself?
Certainly. So I'm Michael Barbour. I'm a professor at Touro University, California in beautiful Vallejo. And it is 10 a.m. here, to contrast it, although still on the 25th of June. And so I've been, I guess, faculty here now for just over 8 years, but I've been in academia now for over 20. My focus has typically been upon distance online and blended learning at the K-12 or primary and secondary level, pretty much my entire career. And I'm happy to chat about this stuff today with you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And the reason why I contacted you was that you were mentioned in an article in a Norwegian magazine. Yeah, and the theme, the topic was how to prevent or different school systems and how to prevent absence from school or school absence. So you had some interesting thoughts and insights in that article. So first of all, how would you define blended learning?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not a fan of the term blended learning. I think it's an industry term that ed tech companies came up with to be able to differentiate stuff that we, in all honesty, have been doing for decades as a way to sort of market and sell their products. Really, blended learning is just good technology integration. And if you look at pretty much any definition that you see of blended learning, regardless if it's in the K-12 or in the higher ed environment. And then you go back to like the 1970s and the 1980s and look at the definitions of technology integration. It's pretty much the same. I mean, it's using technical tools, regardless if they're online or in a face-to-face environment, to be able to leverage opportunities for learning. And in some cases, that means extending it beyond the boundaries of your four walls of your classroom, or in some cases, extending the temporal boundaries of your class, so that instead of having all of the students in the room taking the same subject at the same time, you have the ability to have some of the students in there engaged in one course, another group of students engaged in another course, because there's a temporal distance that's happening there. So it's not a physical distance, but a time distance, if you will.
Yeah.
And these tools can be used for, a variety of these kinds of variety of these kinds of more flexible learning environments. And it's really the same kinds of things we were doing in the 1980s, to be honest with you. When you think back to, the old audio graphics or telematics systems, or when we were looking at computer assisted instruction back then, or if you go back to, the early days of correspondence education, not all correspondence education was at a distance. Being in Norway, and I'm originally from Newfoundland, Canada. So geographically, I'm familiar with what you're up against. You've got a couple of large population centers, and then you've got a really big country that has very little people in it outside of that. And in many cases, very difficult to get to those places as well. So when I was growing up, it wasn't uncommon for students to be in a room where the teacher might be teaching, ninth grade math, or in our case, oftentimes it was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, because it was a small rural all grade school that had a multi-graded classroom because you just didn't have enough students. So you had a math teacher there teaching 7th, 8th, and 9th grade at the same time. And then you might have one grade 12 student in the corner that had the correspondence material that was coming out from the Ministry of Education. So in theory, they were being taught by the correspondence teacher, but they were sitting in the room of the math teacher. So he could or she could walk over in the corner and help them through that material. And, that's, it's a very low tech way, but it is a good example of blended learning that would have been happening in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s for that matter. As you can tell, this is something that gets me riled up, because here in the US, and you guys are, I think, a little bit more protected against it compared to the way we are here, but the role of business and industry within education over here is very apparent, to the point that there are these, national corporations that actually directly run schools. And we've got these voucher programs where you've got public funds going to private school tuition. And also, so the fact that you've got, an industry created term that was largely derived to essentially increase marketing, that unfortunately now has been sort of, become the nomenclature, if you will, within education. It's a little bit disappointing, but that's neither here nor there, because we've been doing blended learning for decades now, and some folks do it much better than others. And in all cases, I think that it allows us to have that ability to be flexible in how we provide learning for students.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm just curious, because here in Norway, and I think also that is for all the Scandinavian countries and Europe in general, you have a debate, a discussion, a public discussion regarding the use of computers and iPads, tablets in teaching. You have the same discussion in the US?
We have a discussion around it, but it's I think a little bit of a different discussion. So as I understand it from my European colleagues, and I've been getting more active, especially since the pandemic started, within a European context. Although I'll be honest with you, prior to the pandemic, most of my experience was in North America or in places like New Zealand, Australia, a couple of Asian countries, really missing sort of a lot of the European aspect. From what I understand, a lot of your discussion is about the appropriateness of these tools in the classroom. And while there is some discussion around that, it's less about the tools over here and more about specific uses of the tools. So when we talk about whether or not we should be using, cell phones in the classroom, it's usually around the idea of, or tablets or whatever, if they can be a distraction, conversations around screen time, although most of the screen time conversations usually are for out of school, not necessarily in school. The largest debates that we're having here in North America, I think, around the tools is essentially the appropriateness of the specific ones that are being used, and sort of how they're being used. And there is a little bit of discussion around privacy and data, although in all honesty, you guys are light years ahead of us on that anyway.
Right.
I don't think that's much of a discussion for you guys, because you guys have such great protections in Europe compared to what we have here in North America, particularly for our students. But so there is some discussion, but I don't think it's the same kinds of conversations.
I see. So before we started the recording, I said that then you usually finish a conversation with two, what's the word in English? Two regular questions. What do you want the listener to take home from the conversation, and tip of the day? So I'm just that's mentioned. Now I wonder, blended learning, school absence, and neurodevelopment diagnosis. How to include everybody, and including those with a higher learning potential. Any thoughts about that?
Well, one of the things I think that when you're looking at these digital tools and how they can be used in flexible learning environments, whatever label you're putting on it, if it's blended learning, hybrid learning, flexible learning, online or distance learning, I think the main thing to be looking at is how we can leverage these tools to serve learners who aren't being served right now in the traditional environment. And this is not a new problem. The reality is 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, this was an issue. It was just an issue that we just ignored, or we assumed the teachers would address it or not, and that's it. Whereas now, we've got a society where we have, and I think we've done a better job of recognizing the fact that not everybody learns well encased in four walls with desks that are facing the front, with a teacher at the front of the room with a white or green or blackboard behind them, regardless if it's digital or analog. In these little 60 or 90 or 75-minute blocks that are cut up into, or sometimes 40-minute blocks that are cut up to, 4 to 7 of them throughout the day that work through a 4 by 15-day timetable. That kind of structure isn't the best way for everybody to learn. But trying to get beyond that, I think, it has been an issue that we've had for a long time. And I think these digital tools really allow us the flexibility to do some of these things. And in all honesty, the university environments, particularly here in North America, have recognized this for a long time, because even when I was an undergrad, we started to see a movement from having these social and administrative student centers and these academic libraries to having the two of them kind of come together. And, most cases, the early ones anyway, were usually called student life centers or student learning centers. But they were more informal places that students could come to learn. I remember back in the early 2000s, someone described it to me. It would be like if Starbucks and the library had a child, this is kind of what it would look like. And we haven't done that in the K-12 system, in the primary and secondary system. We're still back in the academic on one side and the social sphere on the other side. And we haven't really found a way to make that come together into that more flexible environment, with the exception of, these isolated cases. And one of the things I think that we've seen, particularly over the last 4 years, is this understanding that a lot of parents for the first time have had an opportunity to sort of see what happens in those four walls with the desks and facing the front with the whiteboard or blackboard or green board, because most of us, while we went through this, we just assumed that schooling has advanced the same way most other industries have advanced. And until we get, until we're actually sat in the room, or during the pandemic, sat at the kitchen table while, doing your work, while your child is on the other end of the table in their classroom, you don't realize how little has changed within the school environment. So these types of tools and this idea of rethinking how we provide learning how we can be more flexible, has the opportunity to serve a lot of students that struggle, not because they're not bright, capable students, but just because
True.
they don't work in that very rigid structure that we've provided.
Yeah, true. So concerning alternative learning arenas, in the article where you were mentioned, blended learning, full-time online learning, supplemental online learning, and hybrid learning were mentioned as a key or different way to organize. Could you just give a short, what's what in that context?
Sure. I think in that particular article, and it mirrors what a lot of the academic literature discusses, the way in which they use those terms. So I'll start off with the two online learning. So supplemental online learning is when a student is enrolled in a brick and mortar school. And while they might take most of their courses, most of their classes from a teacher in that building in the more traditional context, they may take one or more courses online to supplement what they can't get in the classroom. A good example of this, and one that comes, from my own province and probably speaks a lot to your context as well. You've got a kid in this rural area where they want to take an advanced class or an esoteric class that the school in that small rural community just doesn't have enough students to offer. So instead of them having to pick something that they don't want to take, they could take that one class online, but they're still doing all of their other classes during, in the school itself. Or another common example we often see is that, again, in a smaller school, although it happens in larger schools as well, oftentimes you have courses that are scheduled against each other. And if I'm a student who wants to take, both, say, an advanced chemistry class as well as my instrumental music class, if they're both scheduled during the same slot, I've got to choose between the two now. Whereas if I've got the option of doing one of them online, I can take one of them in the classroom and still enroll in the other one. So that's supplemental. Full-time is when full-time online learning would be instances where students actually don't come to school. They do all of their learning at a distance. We can think of over 100 years of experience with this, because we've seen it, in Canada. It was initially with lighthouse, kids that were the children of lighthouse keepers. They're the only people on the island or out on that particular peninsula. So there is no school. So they were doing 100% of their learning at a distance. And we have a lot of that happening now still, for a variety of reasons. You've got a kid in a rural area who's being bullied for, could be any number of reasons, from neurodivergency to, sexual orientation to, a lot of the reasons why folks in my day got bullied. Just they were a little bit different than the rest. It's not that they can't learn, and it's not that they're capable students. It's the environment that's preventing them from learning. So if you remove them from that environment, they can become, quite capable and great students. But if they're in a small rural community where there's only the one school, you can't remove them from that environment unless, they're full-time at a distance or full-time online. In terms of blended and hybrid, these are terms that often get used interchangeably from an academic sense, and I believe from the article sense. Blended was when you had essentially learning happening in a face-to-face setting, but you were using online tools at the same time. So you're blending the online and the face-to-face together. Hybrid was when you had one or the other happening. So you had a student who might be, taking 60% of their math class in a face-to-face environment with more traditional instruction, but 40% was happening when the teacher wasn't in the room, or for that matter, when the student wasn't at the school. So while you still had online and face-to-face happening, they weren't happening at the same time. So that's the more traditional or rigid definition of those two. Although, in all honesty, blended and hybrid often get used interchangeably. And the distinction that I just gave you is a very academic one. In practice, oftentimes you see them both happening on a day-to-day basis, depending on the day.
Well, thank you for that. And I wonder, in which direction, the traditional way to organize school? Is attendance at the school building, in a classroom, in a group, and also for the social benefit of it? But in what direction would you say that the school system are heading?
Well, actually, I think there's two things to talk about there. One is that idea of the social benefit of schooling, and I think that's an important thing to mention because, it is a particular aspect of online and digital and flexible learning environments that gets raised a lot.
Mhm.
And yes, while schools are an agent of socialization for our children, in many cases, actually, I would say in most cases, they're not the only agent of socialization that we have for children. And I would say that in many cases, it's not even the best agent of socialization that we have. While we're often nostalgic about, the days gone by and stuff like that, but I think that most adults, if they were to sit back and honestly think about their adolescent years and think about their schooling experience, I'm willing to bet that the majority, more than half, would say that the interactions that they had with people in their school probably weren't the most positive interactions when you're looking at your peers. I'm an accomplished academic. And, I think back to my time, and even as a high school student, I was a good student. I was on most of the sports teams. I was involved in a number of other, extracurricular things. My high school days weren't good times for me.
I can relate to that.
And I would imagine most adults can, to be honest with you. So I think the socialization aspect oftentimes is used as a red herring because, the things that I think about when I look at the positive aspects of socialization for me, many of them were in the organizations that I chose to be a part of, not the ones that I had to be a part of legally. And I think that would be true of ours. The other thing is it also makes the assumption that that online environments can't act as an agent of socialization. And I think for any of us that have kids, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't have any myself, but I have nieces and nephews. And when I look at how they interact with their peers, in all honesty, with the exception of times where they're legally required to be together, the majority of their interactions are mediated by technology. Usually something, like this, that sits in their hand or their pocket. Actually, it doesn't sit in their pocket because it's never in their pocket. It's always in their hand. I mean, and I think as a parent, most folks can relate to that. So having education delivered in an environment where we can actually help them model and teach them positive ways to socialize in that kind of environment, I think would be good because that's something that is currently missing for the most part from our education system. And I would suggest that it's one of the reasons why the online sphere is like it is now. Now, to your specific question, that's sort of, where I see things going, where I see education going. I guess there's sort of two ways to answer that. There's where I'd like it to go and where I actually see it going. Where I see it going is probably much like we've seen for the past couple of decades. The brick and mortar 4 classrooms, desks in a row, or maybe we'll put them in little pods or something like that. Teacher walking around at the front of the room, or maybe they'll do circles if it's in pods, that kind of thing. I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that has been the dominant form of learning for really the last half century. Or more. Some people would even say the last century. And it's been quite effective for the majority of students. I think what you're going to see and what we've seen for the past decade, and probably the reason why you saw me in that article and the reason why you had enough interest to learn, to talk more about the topic, is because I think we're going to see more and more these flexible or alternative environments coming about. And while they won't be the norm, they will become common. And they'll be used a lot more to address those students that have difficulty in that more traditional environment. What I'd like to see I'd like to see every single school look like a Starbucks, to be perfectly honest with you. Because, let's face it, if at least here in North America, most of the large urban Starbucks, they've got a room off to the side that you can reserve for meeting space, which kind of looks like a classroom. They've got these little pods that they have where the seats are kind of, and especially if the room isn't a square, if it's in, say, an L shape or something, you've got these little areas that people can congregate together. And you've also got, these places where you can just sit by yourself and work on things, and if you think about a classroom looking like that, where you've got a big room that has all of these flexible environments, you've got a little study room off to the side that's big enough for small group instruction. You've got the old style study carousels where I can put my headphones on and I've got the walls around me so that, no one can disturb me, kind of thing. So I can do, work on. That's the way every classroom should look. And that would be my ideal, because then a teacher can use the training that they've been given and the experience that they have to recognize, okay, I've got 6 students here that are all having the same problem. Let's go over into this little breakout room and let's work through this so that I don't have to do it retail. I can be walking around the room and I see, little Jill over there in the corner, and she's getting things done and she hasn't had any questions, and I see her working through things. So I'm going to leave her alone because she's doing okay. It allows the teacher to use the skills and the knowledge that they have to really individualize or personalize that instruction.
So would you say that with that kind of with that type of organization in the classroom, would you say that the individual student, both the developmental and the student that are at the higher end of learning achievement, that the teacher is more able to provide assistance to each one?
Yes, and if I said earlier about how the current model is the model that we've had for decades, and it's interesting because when you listen to sort of the advocates of this model, they'll talk about the factory model of education and how it came about at the turn of the last century and that kind of thing. But that's not the case. If you look at most schools, not just in North America, but really worldwide, right up until World War II for the most part, in many cases, you had these teachers that were responsible for teaching all of the subject areas. And in many cases, you had multi-graded classrooms, even in large urban areas, because they had these small neighborhood schools. So you had kids that were, over 2 or 3 or 4 different grades. And if you think back to that time, the teacher couldn't get up there and teach for 60 minutes on a specific topic like, grade 8 history. Because there was only 3 grade 8 history kids in the room of 25 that you had. So you had to basically do these sort of little learning episodes around the room and figuring out what people needed, and also allowing the students to really teach each other. This idea of creating a learning community within the classroom, where you had the folks who were in high school that were helping the elementary students with their mathematics because they had already finished whatever the teacher had asked them to do during that period of time. You had this intergenerational learning happening within the classroom. So it's not a new concept. It's actually an old concept that I think needs to be revived. And it's one that when you look at the proponents and the advocates of all of these alternative models that we're talking about, they don't go back to those days of, the one room schoolhouse kind of model with the multi-grade, multi-aged, multi-subject teacher. They look at it as, okay, how can we introduce digital tools into the classroom so that the math teacher can teach, 30 different students grade 9 math in 30 different ways to those individual students. And that's really that is actually the industrial way of thinking. It's that idea of how can we use the factory to essentially customize the standard process at the end of the day. Because that's the other thing too. I mean, this movement that you see primarily in North America, although it's been creeping more and more into, European countries as well, towards these discrete standards that folks have to learn and that they're tested against. That's all this idea of how do we create a factory model of education where I can just tick off the 30, the 132 things that you need to learn in your grade 12 chemistry class.
Yeah. Now I wonder, because in the article, you said that it's all about how the available tools are utilized and what the child needs. Could you elaborate around that?
Certainly. Anyone who will tell you that this type of learning is not appropriate for this type of student is basically doing you a disservice or being disingenuous with their statements. The reality is every single learning tool, for that matter, every single learning context, has certain affordances and limitations. Mm-hmm. Right. And what you look to do as a teacher, as a professional, is you look at what you are trying to accomplish with this particular learning episode. You look at who your learners are and what their needs are, and you make decisions about strategies and tools and pedagogies and support materials and resources based upon what they can offer you, as well as trying to overcome any limitations. A good example, and I use this one quite frequently because it's one I think everyone can relate to, is if you think about a class discussion. If I'm in a face-to-face environment, I can throw out a question and ask my students to, comment on a particular topic. Some of the affordances of that is I can see everybody who's participating and I can get a sense as to, who isn't. I'm getting their first opinions on it, so it gives everyone an equal opportunity to participate because it doesn't require them to go out and do any research or have any advanced knowledge of things because they're all getting it at the same time. By the same token, one of the limitations of that is the fact that because they're all getting it at the same time, in many cases, the interactions that I'm having aren't that deep. They're not drawing upon a level of knowledge that I might want with the topic. Their ability to interact with each other is going to be limited because not only are they hearing my question for the first time, but they're hearing everyone else's response for the first time. So they don't have a lot of time to really formulate, these well thought out interactions with each other. Whereas if I do that exact same activity, say in an online discussion forum in a learning management system, I just ask them all, okay, tomorrow we are going to talk about this. And then when they walk in the room tomorrow, I can, have them all open up their computers and their tablets and have them post a response. And then on the third day, I can have them go in and say, okay, I'm going to want you to interact with at least 3 of your peers. That kind of model, because I've given them the space and the time, allows them to develop a much more deeper understanding of it because they don't have to speak directly to each other. It allows them to interact a little bit more freely because they're, in a classroom, if they all talked at the same time, no one would be able to hear anybody. Whereas in an online environment, they can all be typing at the same time and it doesn't matter. So there are certain affordances and limitations of each of those kinds of environments. And depending upon what I want from that discussion, as well as the nature of my students. If I've got a really shy group this year, maybe I go with the online way of doing it. If I've got a group that doesn't mind, speaking their opinions whenever you give them the opportunity, maybe I do it in a live face-to-face session. So each of those kinds of tools, and regardless of what strategies you're picking, they have certain affordances and limitations. And as teachers, one of the things that we have been and that we should be taught more of in our teacher education programs, our teacher training programs, is to recognize what the affordances and limitations of each of these tools are so that we can make those decisions based upon our knowledge of the students, our knowledge of the curriculum that we're trying to cover, the goals that we have for that particular activity, and the years of experience that we bring to our classroom.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, again, in the article where I first noticed your name, it says that the Canadian school system is one of the world's best. I wonder, why is that, and what can one learn from this?
Well, one of the things is that first of all, the Canadian school system isn't a single system. Education in Canada is through our Constitution is at the provincial level. So really, there are 13 different school systems, one for each of the 10 provinces and one for each of the 3 territories. And so there's differences in curriculum across the province. There's provinces. There's difference in just how the schools are structured. Some provinces have middle schools, others don't. Some provinces have a primary section and an elementary section. Other provinces just have a single elementary section. If you're qualified to teach in one province or certified to teach in one province, you are not necessarily certified to teach in another province. So if you're you still have to, in many cases, it's just a bit of paperwork and a fee that you have to pay to get certified in that other province. But in some cases, it actually requires you to, do additional university coursework, depending upon where you got your degree and what the requirements are for that particular province. So when you look across, so there are multiple jurisdictions now. Each of the individual provinces do tend to score fairly highly on most international assessment tools that they have. Although, in all honesty, you've seen that many of them have started to decline in recent years. And not just the decline that everyone has experienced due to the pandemic, but you've seen them sort of starting to drop a little bit. And one of the reasons I'd attribute that to is the fact that we're starting to see more of the U.S. influence coming into the Canadian system. Because in all honesty, the most Canadian provinces were set up originally in terms of how they viewed curriculum, how they viewed teaching, very much like many of the Scandinavian countries were, many of the Nordic countries. Whereas we're starting to see a big difference happening now. Just one that as an example that most people, I think in your context would find interesting is in the U.S., when you get certified to be a teacher, you're not certified to be a teacher. You're certified to be a very specific type of teacher. So you're certified to teach high school math. And that's all you're allowed to teach. The school can't hire you to teach, social studies or English. You're a high school math teacher. Whereas most Canadian jurisdictions, and I understand this to be true of Europe as well, you're just certified as a teacher. I don't have it up on my wall behind me anymore now, but I used to in my old office. I had my teacher's certificate there, and it just says Newfoundland Teaching Certificate, and that's all. So, now my area was, I was a high school social studies teacher, but if you wanted to hire me to teach kindergarten, you're allowed to do that. I don't know why you would, and I would never apply for a job at kindergarten because, hats off to every person out there who's, teaching the 5 and 6 year olds out there because, they are doing God's work as far as I'm concerned. But you're able to do that. This idea of, I mentioned earlier about these very discrete standards contrasted with, I imagine most countries that were probably listening to your podcast are more familiar with these broader competencies. Now, they might use the term standards, but you wouldn't have a 4-month high school course that has 130 of these standards or competencies. Whereas, having, several dozen of these is a common thing for most U.S. curriculums. Whereas in Canada, we have historically had these much broader competencies that you had. I remember when I was teaching in high school, one of the competencies that I was responsible for teaching was making sure students understood, the short-term and long-term causes of various global conflicts. Now, that's a very broad thing. You could use it to teach, the 4 long-term causes and the 1 immediate cause of World War I. But you could also use it to look at, the war on terror that we had. And those are 2 very different. Whereas in a U.S. curriculum, each of there would be a standard that said, what were the 4 long-term causes of World War I? There would be a standard that said, what was the immediate cause of World War I? There would be a standard, what was the immediate cause of the U.S. war on terror? There would be very discrete things. So, I think that's one of the big differences that we see within the Canadian system, and one of the reasons why I think it's usually done well on those rankings. In many ways, many of the same reasons why many of the Nordic countries have done well. this idea of focusing up on standards and standardization and the testing and the regimental aspect of it, that all of those things bring to the classroom. This idea of teaching to the test would be a foreign concept to most of your local listeners. And while we hear a little bit of it here in Canada because of that American influence, for most teachers, they wouldn't know what test you were talking about.
I see. I see. Well, we have the same. Yeah, we have some national tests, and that you are when you are approaching that test, you go through the previous year's tests so that you are prepared for how the test is set up. And but of course, it's with a new type of assignments and tasks, but so that you are familiar with how the test is designed. Now, I wonder, is there anything before we get to the last two points? Is there anything that you want to within the topic of blended learning and the talking points we've been through? Is there anything that you would like to mention?
Well, I think I just want to underscore this idea of two ideas really. The first would be that this isn't necessarily a conversation around a broken education system. As I mentioned earlier, the education systems that we have do work for a large number, and I would even say the majority of students that we have out there. What we're looking at when we talk about these more flexible learning environments is how can we design things that would address their learning needs because they're not being addressed now. And when I'm work with folks in the school system, regardless if it's at the district level, the school level, or even at the ministry and department level, one of the things I often say is that when you're looking at these environments, it's not like it's an individualized model. All of this discussion around individualized learning and personalized learning that you hear, these are largely industry terms that they're using to try to sell products that they claim will do these things. The reality is if you have a group of students that aren't being served, there's still commonalities within that group, and there's still subgroups within that group. So as an example, and I can't remember if this one was used in the article or not, but I always use it. There's a program in Michigan that I often talk about in Port Huron, just about an hour north of Detroit, right actually at the Canadian-U.S. border, right where the Blue Water Bridge is. And they had a population of students that were, for the most part, suspended or excluded from the school environment, in most cases because they were involved in the juvenile justice system. And because they were involved in the juvenile justice system, many of them, as a condition of their sentence or as a part of their parole, had the requirement that they have to be in school. How do you be in school when you're suspended or expelled from school? Right. So, they were creating an environment where, because the justice system and the education system were two separate things, that, they were essentially assigning these kids to a life of crime because they were breaking the law because they couldn't actually attend school. So the school district there said, okay, well, how can we address this issue? Because of who these students are, their backgrounds, and we don't want them in the regular school building with the other students because they're a disruptive environment. So how can we create a program around what their needs were? So they took one of the old elementary schools that had closed because of declining enrollment, and they said, okay, we're going to use this building. And they started looking at who this population of students were. Many of them had commitments during the day, as an example. They were working to help support their families. They were having to look after younger siblings. Many of them had children of their own. So that idea of being in a school from 8 to 3 or 9 to 4 or whatever the timeline was on 5 days a week wasn't necessarily good for them. again, because these students had struggled throughout school and in many cases just been socially promoted in their younger grades, a lot of them, didn't learn how to learn. They didn't have a lot of the background knowledge, but also background dispositions and attitudes towards schooling that was needed. So this particular district creates what they called an online program, but the reality is it was kind of like a hybrid program. This school that they had was open from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening, Monday through Thursday, from 8 to 4 on Friday and Saturday. Half of the teachers were there at any given time. So they were able to split up the teacher's day so that you had the coverage for that additional time. And all of the education, all of the learning that these students were taking was delivered in an online fashion. So the teachers were in the building, but the students were learning online. Now, the students were actually supposed to be in the building as well. They were required to spend at least 8 hours a week in at least 2 sittings every single week in the building. Now, they could spend more if they wanted to, but that was a minimum. So I could come in for 6 hours on one day and 2 hours another day. I could come in for 2 hours every single night during the week, and then maybe 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon, to get my 8 hours in there. I could come in for 7 hours on Saturday and just come in 1 hour sometime during the week and meet that requirement. But what it allowed was the students the flexibility to do the other things in their life that were necessary. And as well, it allowed the school this notion that I know that I'm going to see the student at least once I'm going to see the student sometime this week. So if there are issues with their progress, I can sit down with them and try to figure out what those are. Now, the learning was delivered online, but instead of the traditional model where you would take, 4 or 5 classes at any given time. And if you think about a traditional school, I am taking 5 different courses in 1 hour slots throughout the day. And that's my 5 hours, or, 4 classes in 90-minute slots or what have you. These students were only enrolled in 2 courses at a time. And there wasn't any minimum requirement that they spend any amount of time on each of these. So if I wanted to, for the next 5 weeks, just do the math course, I could do that. If I wanted to just code switch or task switch between the math course and, say, the history course, I could do that. And the second that I finished one course, I'd be automatically enrolled in whatever the next course was. So over the course of the 10-month school year, they'd still usually take the same number of courses that they would have if they were in a traditional environment. But instead of doing them 4 or 5 at a time, they were doing them 2 at a time. So it allowed them to have, because if you think about it, even just ourselves, in our own professional environments, if we've got 5 different projects that are totally disconnected from each other, the ability to just stop one and then start thinking about another and know exactly where you are and remember everything that you were working on yesterday is a little bit difficult. But that's how we organize our schools. We have these 60-minute blocks, and then they've got 3 minutes to move to whatever the next classroom is. And then we ask them to focus on a completely different topic that had nothing to do with the one that they were just in.
True.
And try to remember what they were doing 24 hours ago when we were doing that last. Right. So that, decreasing just that number from 4 or 5 down to 2, really helped a great deal. And there were other little things that they did throughout the school, but, they specifically designed that for that particular population. Now, would that work for a group of, say, neurodivergent students? Maybe not. They took this particular population, this, group that was involved in the juvenile justice system that had been excluded from schools, and designed a learning experience just for them. And I use that as an illustration because when you think about the 20% or the 30% or even the half of students that aren't served by our traditional environment, it's not like we've got to come up with a unique model for every single one of them. They can be grouped into these different groups so that we come up with a program that might be useful for 6% of them, and a different program that, and it might have some overlap with that first program that addresses, the needs of this other 4% that we've got over here. So when I work with schools, the first thing I always ask them are, what are the learning characteristics of the population that you're trying to address? And it can't be just those other students. You've got to figure out what specific population within those students that are being served that you're working with.
Quite interesting, I must say. And thank you for that final story. And I would say that, and that also is a fine conclusion for this conversation before we go to the final points of our list. Now, I wonder, what do you want the listener to take home from this conversation?
Well, it's again to underscore one of the things that we had talked about earlier. Regardless if you're talking about a particular learning environment or a particular tool or a particular group of students, conversations around, this topic isn't appropriate for that particular strategy, or this topic isn't appropriate to be taught online, or this topic isn't appropriate to use some sort of digital tool for it. Those are red herring conversations. Every single pedagogy, every single strategy, every single resource, every single tool that we might choose to use, regardless if it's digital or analog, has certain affordances and certain limitations. And as teachers, we want to make sure that we are making those pedagogical decisions based upon what we want from an activity and the affordances and limitations that come with using those different items. And really, we want to create environments that allow teachers to do that as well. So for those in your audience who might be at the policy end or at the legislative end, we want to make sure that our professionals who we've invested a lot of money into training and that we pay good salaries to because they are professionals, we want to make sure that they can use that knowledge, that training, that judgment, that experience to make these decisions based upon the affordances and limitations of the specific things that they're looking at, based upon the particular goals for an activity or learning episode.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the final point, tip of the day. Do you have anything you would like to share? Like a website, a book, podcasts? Yeah.
Tip of the day. Any student can learn in any environment. The key is finding which environment will work for specific students.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, again, thank you very much for taking the time, Michael. And it was a true pleasure for me to have you as a guest in my podcast, even a Norwegian podcast. And yeah, thank you very much.
Not a problem. It was a pleasure chatting.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye-bye.
That concludes this episode. But before our ways part, remember to follow the podcast on Spotify or where you listen to podcasts. Also, remember to follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Also, if you want the latest news and posts from the blog, you can sign up to the newsletter from spesblog.no. If you have any comments or want to get in touch, don't hesitate to send me a PM or email at question@spesblog.no. As always, I really appreciate if you rate, share and recommend the podcast. And finally, thank you to all of you that listened to this episode, and a warm welcome to new listeners and followers. And a special thanks to Mr. Barbour for taking the time to join me for this episode. I hope to meet you again in the next episode of Corner of Special Education. Until then, take care.